Welcome to the really personal part of this channel where you get to see me with my unshaved face, backlighting, and messy hair. I'm trying to write a musical about Red String, and I wanted to share the story of where that came from, because I learned there actually is a musical already out there about Red String, and this one's going to be completely different from what I understand. I haven't actually seen that one yet. I was learning about plot narrative stuff in the MFA creative writing program, and we were talking about narrative distance. I had become kind of obsessed with reading Chuck Tingle, and he writes first person present tense stuff, she sees this, she goes there, and in some writing circles that is generally kind of looked sideways at, like as being, unless it's done for a really good reason, it's considered maybe sort of more lowbrow. And so there was a little bit of pushback in the program, like, why not, don't do that, but why are you doing that? And so I started to think about, well, what does that do, writing in certain tenses like that? And I was like, well, it puts the narrator really close to what's happening. You're telling it as you see it. And, as opposed to something where maybe the story is all told in flashback and you have the option to zoom back out to who's telling the story and when, and maybe it's, a year later or 1,000 years later or whatever, and someone's saying, oh, but now. And when you don't have any of that, it changes how you tell the story. And so then I was like, well, I like extremes and exploring opposites and all of that. So what about something where the place that the narrator is at in the story relative to the story being told is always shifting? Like, part of the story is told from the middle looking backwards, and part of it is told from the end looking back to the middle, and you start to get this weave that happens of narrative viewpoints in time. And I started to be like, well, how do you diagram this? And I started to draw these crazy diagrams and be like, with the different places that the narrator is, or the time of the story and who's telling it, you could start to make pictures in 2 dimensions, like diagrams. And I was like, you could make a plot that looks like a pentagram and things like that. And I imagined it being done with like thumbtacks and red string on a wall, like the crazy person thing from like A Beautiful Mind that got lampooned in It's Always Sunny and became like a meme on the internet, the classic like conspiracy thing. And the red string in this case would represent the timeline that's happening through this story and how it's told. There's also the order, not just of the narrator and the narrative, but also the order that it is told to the reader in the book could be different even from those other two. So you get this like tangled web. Anyway, so the phrase came to me, the red string represents time. And I was like, ooh, I like the sound of that. That could be a band's name, an album name. And I was like, no, that's a story name. And so I was still being kind of tongue-in-cheek with the whole thing, just goofing around with it, the conspiracy thing and all that. And I told it to my friend June, and June immediately was like, red string is sacred, right? And I was like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And at first I'm like, does that mean this whole idea is kind of like, I shouldn't do it? And I thought about it more and was like, nah, lean into that. Red string in Western culture, with these couple of incidences of it, it's become, representing madness and conspiracy, but in most cultures at most times, it's had some kind of sacred meaning. And I started to look into it, well, which cultures do this and what does it mean and all, and I was blown away. There seem to be some Native American traditions about that, which I still need to find better resources on. If anyone knows anything about it, please let me know in the comments. The really well-known one in the US is Kabbalah, and there were some celebrities who kind of casually took up Kabbalah, like, oh, that's a thing now, and just wore like a red bracelet as a solidarity thing with that, and they got a lot of heat for it because people were like, are you really? And it became this big controversy. But that's a long-standing tradition that you're supposed to take a red string, ideally that has been stretched across the tomb of Rachel during Passover, and then they cut pieces off of it. But if you don't have the option to go over there, people would just, buy red string bracelets. Some of them, supposedly, the string has been brought over there and been blessed or whatever. But anyway, there's this whole tradition about that. But then meanwhile, it's also a thing in Hinduism where often after pujas, people will wear a red or a gold string, especially a red string after Lakshmi puja seems to be particularly a thing. And in that case, it holds the blessings of the puja. So there's like 8 blessings to do with prosperity and wealth and spiritual well-being and all that. People have been discriminated against for wearing these bracelets in many cases if they're a minority Hindu living in other areas. And so there's a bunch of news stories about that. Then I was looking into like East Asian traditions. There's a whole genre of the red thread stories about supposedly you're born with a red thread coming from your chest or your ankle or various that invisibly connects you to your soulmate who you're destined to meet and fall in love with. And there's this whole tradition of folklore stories, usually about a boy being awful to some girl and later finding out that she was his soulmate and having to make amends. And yeah, that's a whole thing. And now there's a whole modern genre of romance stories about that. But in China and in Korea and Japan, there's also a broader folklore to do with red string. I was reading about, especially in Korea, and I'm not sure how widespread it is, that people will, sometimes when a pet passes away, tie red string around the paw, sometimes with a lock of their own hair tied to it as well. And it's to connect you so that when you pass, you can find each other again in the afterlife. And I thought that was pretty beautiful. And then there's this broader feeling that red thread, it's not just about connecting you to one other individual. The idea of the red thread of fate is much broader, and in China it's considered that any meeting, even just among business partners or other chance things like that, could be considered the work of the red thread of fate, that everything that happens is woven by this. And there's this sort of determinism, fatalist kind of a viewpoint that comes with that, which can be looked at as a negative to people who are deeply in the rugged individualist, personal accountability kind of narrative. But they've actually done studies showing how this belief in fate leads to positive outcomes for both negative and positive events that happen. With a negative event, if you call it fate, it deflects a lot of the blame, which otherwise often makes something even worse, where people are so concerned with placing blame for what happened that it gets in the way of actually just moving on and doing the best thing you can about it. And when something positive happens, people get overly concerned with credit and instead calling it just fate. Oh, I was just fated to succeed at this. Brings a certain humility with it. And in both cases, it leads to a more pro-social kind of an outcome. So I've been weaving together all of these things along with other ancient stories, there's the story of the labyrinth of Crete, where in some versions, I think it is a red thread gets used as the path back out of the labyrinth. And there's just so many different rich variants of meaning around red thread. And I feel like people focus so much on the divisions and differences when really these stories connect us all. So I'd love to hear from you in the comments if you feel like this is an idea you're excited about hearing more about.